Hey everybody, today I am going to be reviewing Tenet. This film is written and directed by Christopher Nolan. This is Nolan's follow-up to his critically acclaimed film Dunkirk, which came out in 2017. And for those of you who have seen my review for that film, you know that this was a film that I really loved, and I nearly threw my hands up in elation while watching it, just because this is, as everyone knows, a director that I've really struggled with a lot in the past, and finally I was seeing him reach his full potential. He was able to minimize his weaknesses and completely capitalize on his strengths in a way that I felt just made everything effortless, concise, and tense, and just brilliantly constructed. Stripping the concepts back and really just focusing on their basic, most fundamental functions, and then he's expanding what you would consider a third act of a film into 3 separate acts into a feature-length film. And he really focuses on the immediacy, the tension, and using 3 different storylines with varying timelines to explore the mechanics of time and how that inherently manipulates the viewing experience. There is no gratuity in that film. They got rid of all of the clunky dialogue, and he didn't even try to create characters here of any sort. And I found that that worked for this type of film. There was something very refreshing about it, and I completely championed it all the way through. Now, admittedly, going into this one, I had seen a lot of advertisements and a lot of people had told me about the film, so based on that, I was worried that this was going to be another example of him reverting back to his old ways. A lot of the things that I find to be really indulgent about him and ultimately limiting to him as a creator. When you take a lot of the metaphors that people use to experiment with the idea of film being an illusion, that's really interesting. And when Nolan makes them more literal, making it his own thing, I think that's also kind of interesting to an extent. There is a unique power to that. But when the mechanics become too much the focus of the piece, for me, it causes the inside to feel hollow. But I gotta tell you, now having seen the film, I have a lot of opinions on it. My emotions are all over the map in terms of how I reacted to it. Yes, in a way, this is by far his most indulgent, most shameless, most I don't give a shit, I'm Chris motherfucking Nolan type of movie. And it really causes a hindrance when you're watching the film, because the film never really becomes anything or materializes into anything that is remotely coherent. And I think that this type of film exposes his flaws in a more glaring fashion. However, again, for whatever reason, there was something about the shamelessness that sort of compelled me. Because even through the shamelessness, there is an ease about him, and just that he feels very comfortable what he's doing. He's in his element, whether it makes sense to people or not. And I actually found his self-awareness in this film and his ability to mock himself more apparent than usual. He isn't even going to pretend to engage you with characters and motivations, because that's not what he's trying to do. These characters are a lot more like the ones in Dunkirk, in the sense that they are more chess pieces on a board, and they're meant to serve a function for an overall higher concept, rather than focusing on the empathy of an individual. So he literally has the main character who has no backstory, nothing about him, not even a name. His character is the protagonist. And you have a clear antagonist here, and they bring that up multiple times in the movie. There are a lot of references, conscious references in the dialogue to film techniques, such as Hitchcock and his quote about the anticipation of a bomb going off, as an example. He's taking all of these blueprints and classic film composition that we know, and he's making them abstract, and he's turning them into pieces of a puzzle that we can rearrange, very much like a Rubik's Cube. He's obviously really a fan of very expensive, very sleek, sterile architecture and costume design that has a really, like a classic, timeless quality to it. Very similar to a lot of Hitchcock films. I mean, even the main female in the film, the blonde, she wore a lot of tailored suits that did remind me of the elusive gray suit that Madeline wore in Vertigo, for example. He obviously has a soft spot in his heart for like espionage thrillers and James Bond, and so he's incorporating all of that into the higher concepts here. And it just seemed to me that he was always very aware of the pretentiousness here, because yes, I do believe that Nolan is quite pretentious to an extent, and the indulgence was apparent too. And most importantly, the recognition that the dialogue here is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, I've always hated Nolan dialogue. That's not something that I think a lot of people would really consider is a strength for Nolan. The clunkiness, the endless boring exposition that just lays everything out for you on the surface. It does not do the story structure or the climactic build of the film any favors at all. And here it's even more of a muddled mess. It's even more shameless than it ever was, it feels like. And again, there was something about that I found kind of entertaining. I couldn't help but really laugh a lot during this movie. This is absolutely one of the funniest movies that Christopher Nolan has ever made, and it's pointedly funny too. He's certainly playing it up. Honestly, it reminded me of the very excessive and very maddening dialogue that you might get in maybe like the first Matrix film, or even the ones that precede it. And you know, they do tend to be quite cartoony as well, and fun. Some of this I think Nolan is very aware of, and some of it I don't think he's aware of. So it was like I could both laugh with him and at him, if that makes any sense at all. You know, as I said, I felt a lot of different things, especially listening to the dialogue. I was bored and annoyed, but also really fascinated. So it's a lot of conflicting things. The main line that's really doing the spoon feeding here in terms of how you're supposed to palate the experience is the line, and a lot of people I know have mentioned it. It's, "Don't try and understand it, just feel it." And that line makes me angry in some ways, and in other ways, okay, you know, I can get behind it. I almost respect that line to an extent, because I think at a certain point you do have to give up trying to really put the logistics of everything together. And honestly, partially, part of that is because so much of the dialogue is just drowning in the heaviness of the soundscape and just the heavy thudding bass. When it comes to the score especially, which is not nearly as clunky and heavy as Hans Zimmer would have done it, which I appreciated. Even so, it was very uneven, and it made a lot of what people say hard to decipher at times. And this is, of course, something that I've had an issue with when it comes to Christopher Nolan throughout his career. And I think with a film like this, it's really necessary to be able to hear them. When you purposely have a film or a creator who is using the medium of film to sort of explore and expose the idea of illusions and, you know, film coming from the dream world. All of that is the unconscious state of our ideas, which we've never fully explored naturally. And so to an extent, yes, with those kinds of movies, with David Lynch movies as an example, with Louis Buñuel movies, you do have to kind of just let go and go along with it to a degree, and that can be really, really fun. And there were times that I could do that with this movie, maybe in a different way than I would maybe a David Lynch film as an example, but I was able to let go. And when your film depends so much on exposition for basic comprehension, it's really hard to get into that and really fall into the meditative quality of things. It feels like watching a bunch of beautiful movie stars in expensive restaurants read Wikipedia pages for like an hour. So it's very hard for a lot of those concepts to really marinate within you and then blur the edges of the frame, so you're more one with the experience. But instead, I feel trapped, and a lot of the clunkiness of the way that the story is told, and especially the clunkiness of the dialogue, it causes the momentum of everything to just stop dead in its tracks. And the concept behind Tenet, you know, the actual gimmick that they're using here, a lot of people have tried to wrap their brain around it and try to solve that puzzle, figure out what it really means, and I feel like no amount of excessive explanation in this movie is really going to help you there, especially with an initial experience. And quite honestly, I think if you are taking the gimmick here that literally, you are missing the entire point. If you take this film seriously as some deep work, I kind of feel like that is absolutely the wrong approach. This idea, when you really look at it, is not well thought through. It makes logistic sense in certain instances, and then in others it completely sacrifices that for the convenience of whatever is going on there, which makes things feel very inconsistent. And honestly, it's just naturally that's what happens. Anytime you have a story that is trying to use time travel or something like that, the concept of time, and kind of invert it, you are going to run into logistical problems. And you do have to have suspension of disbelief to a degree. But I feel like here they are really, really reaching here when it comes to suspension of disbelief. And that incoherence makes this one feel like it is a drain that is just clogged, and it's getting more and more clogged. And the whole concept of time, as I've mentioned, is something that is clearly really, really fascinating to Christopher Nolan, and he's been using it since the beginning. You know, even with his second film, Memento, that is a film that is moving backwards in time, but also there are these black and white intercut sections that are moving forward in time. So it's, you know, on a basic level, the exact same concept. So it's an interesting gimmick where you can really play with story structure in a very interesting way, but also really play with the ideas of perception and the context of a situation, how that affects our morals as people, and also how it affects the way that we palate entertainment. All very interesting ideas. And, you know, with Tenet, in a way, on a basic level, they're taking the exact same idea there, but they're trying to take it from more of a symbolic, more metaphorical sort of thing and make it more concrete, more literal as a device. The problem with me, and I've talked about Memento many times and I've reviewed it as well, but the problem for me was, even though I did find it very interesting and compelling, especially on an initial viewing, but when you watch it multiple times, you realize that gimmick starts to wear thin and it's not really explored in a way that I wished it had been. And I have the same issue here, but to a much worse extent. And that just doesn't show me much growth intellectually for the director, because Memento came out 20 years ago. And to me, Tenet and a lot of Christopher Nolan films, in terms of what they're trying to achieve cerebrally, I think they're focused on a lot of the wrong things. If your objective is to really transcend a medium, then you have to move beyond constantly creating these concepts to try to measure your point. You fall into the trap of those ideas becoming one-dimensional. They are ultimately just gimmicks. They don't open up the story or the ideas in a way that satisfies me. You kind of become a victim of your own need to solve the puzzle rather than kind of removing yourself and discovering more beyond that. And the film and the viewer in that sense becomes kind of a victim of their own need to solve the puzzle. And again, that is very limiting. And this film, it's not meant to be emotionally driven, and that's fine. Yet it's introducing emotional concepts within the characters, especially in the third act, to raise the stakes here. Yet that is very counterintuitive to a lot of ideas that the film is presenting here about non-characters and trying to strip them of their motivations down to the very skeleton of things and mixing it up. Yes, these films are not naturally my taste, and I've admitted that very honestly in the past, but quite frankly, it's not the style of the film that bothers me, because his influences, like Stanley Kubrick will say, I think, are able to achieve a lot of that detachedness and that very mathematical sort of storytelling in a far greater fashion. There's a lot of similarities with David Lynch as well, even though they're completely different tonally. David Lynch is the one that excels. I look at a director like Bertrand Bonello, who is a French director, and he made films like Nocturama and House of Tolerance. I've reviewed both films on this channel in the past, but I find him, in a way, he's got a similar sort of coldness, a detached quality where he's not interested in character development either. He is more interested in jumbling the structure in a way that may seem random at first glance, but in fact is very technically controlled and choreographed, so precise. And that is the key. Bertrand Bonello, to me, has reached his full potential more times than one. And he does it because the mechanics work constantly in a way where they are not the focus. They work to build something beyond the individual pieces by blending them seamlessly, transcending what is literal through the building blocks of the mechanics to something deeper. That is the difference. I mean, do you think in some great transcendent moment in your life, or if you're on an acid trip or something like that, you can sit there and try to comprehend it and strategize and have explanations for the experience? No. You've got to let go of it. You've got to relinquish control, and that's how you reach true progression. And Nolan might be telling us to do this in Tenet to an extent, but I don't think he's ever really tried to take a dose of his own medicine in that sense, other than with Dunkirk. And maybe I'm biased because of that, but I can't help but think, after Dunkirk, which I thought was just so exquisite and so wonderful, I want another one. I want another one where the mechanics click together organically and it doesn't feel so labored and so frustrating and so forced. And yet all of the ideas about inverting narrative and seeing things from a different perspective and all of that, it's still there, just handled in a much more sophisticated sense. I don't know what to say. I don't want to say I like it. I don't want to say I hate it, because I'm kind of in the middle here. Tenet was an experience, and I'm all over the place on that. It is beautiful looking, of course, like all Nolan films are, and yet it's not as dazzling as maybe some films he's done in the past, maybe like Inception, for example. The set pieces and some of the action sequences aren't as bold and don't feel as interesting or memorable here. Yet the humor and the self-mockery and all of that I found to be far more entertaining than anything in Inception. It felt so funny and detached and self-indulgent and yet enigmatic and tense and even entertaining at others. With this film, I feel like a lot of flaws were revealed, as I said, and yet there were certain strengths that poked through that I didn't expect from Nolan. But admittedly, overall, I saw way more flaws than I did strengths. I'm not going to say that it's a good film because I don't believe it is for myself, yet I find myself still very interested in a lot of aspects of it. And I do encourage you, if you haven't seen it yet, or if you've already seen it, watch it again. Make those judgments for yourself. I can see myself actually watching this film multiple times. Not so much for the enjoyment of it, but just because I find it interesting to try to pinpoint the ways that the Tenet storytelling device fits in with Nolan's psychology and universe. Yeah, I guess I am recommending it, but with a lot of major caveats. And that's my review. Thank you guys so much for watching. Here are my Patreon supporters. If you are a Patreon supporter, I am doing holiday discounts for my commissioned portraits. So if you're interested in that, you'll just go to Patreon below. I am an artist, I do commissioned portraits, and I sell prints. So if that's something you're interested in, anybody out there, you can just go to my website, deepfocuslens.com, and check out some of my art. The link for that is below. If you have any questions about portraits or anything, if you want to work with me, you can certainly email me in my email below. I'm happy to work with you. But other than that, you can just check out the rest of my social media information below. Watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you want to. Catch you next time.